Welcome to At the Feed Store podcast with me, Erica Lance, where we talk farm, feed, and everything in between. From industry insights to customer stories, we're here to serve up real conversations straight from the heart of rural America. Hello, everyone. Erica Lance here with Feeders Grain and Farm Supply. I'm joined today with Mike, owner of Missouri Southern Seeds. Today, we're going to discuss many different topics, including forage, hay ground, brassicas, and even some wildlife options when it comes to seeds. Thanks, Mike, for coming on today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Erica. Appreciate you.
So at the store here, we carry a lot of different seeds from you guys. And the biggest thing that I wanted to just educate people on what options there is out there and some of the things that they should be looking for, some commonly asked questions when people come into our store.
Perfect.
So I would like to kick it off with just talking about regular forages. So when it comes to pasture ground itself, and this time of year, a lot of guys already have an established pasture, but they're wanting to beef up that pasture and kind of get some interseeding because a lot of these pastures have been in pasture for a very long time.
Right.
Can you kind of run through some of the seeds that you recommend or you see a lot of use with when it comes to pastures?
Sure thing. It's going to depend on the situation. However, majority of pastures in our area and in your area have a fescue base to them. And so a lot of folks would like to deviate and add another component to that. And one item that we typically would always suggest is going to be an orchard grass. And the next one would end up being an intermediate ryegrass. Typically, those two items can provide a different level of palatability and also performance to help get the weight gains coming out of. The other thing that people like to add quite a bit is going to be clovers. You've been awfully dry. We've been very dry the past few years. And a lot of these clovers, both ladinos, red clovers, even lespedizas, they've left our pastures. And to add those back is a nice benefit to increase those protein levels and performance as well.
So when it comes to applying that to the pasture, what is your recommendation? Do you recommend that the guys drill that? Do you see some issues when drilling versus doing the overall broadcasting?
So that's situational as well. We are past our frost seeding point, in my opinion, and that date always changes. We have some years where we're awfully cold and people can still, frost seed clear up to March 15th. Then we've had other years where it's February 15th and, it just seems like we're already losing the frost out of the ground at that point. So don't just go by the calendar. Look at each year as a different year and what you should do. But typically in January and early February for your clovers and your small legumes, you can frost seed those on with your P&K or, on the back of a four-wheeler or however. And that really helps. Frost seeding your grasses, in my opinion, they're soft seeds and hard seeds. And typically your grasses are always going to be a soft seed. And that's not what I would recommend. If you are going to do that, it's best to take a harrow, something to help break up the soil to get that seed into the ground. It's imperative to have seed to soil contact. And if you don't, the customer is going to be awfully upset with the end result. In regards to drilling, typically when we get into that March time frame, depending on weather, and depending on how wet we are too, is going to depend whether you can no-till drill. If we're awfully wet, you're not going to be allowed to do that because you're going to push the seeds too deep. And a lot of seeds really only need to be in the ground, a quarter of an inch to even at most a half inch. If we get past that depth, it's going to have a hard time having emergence. And so that is going to be a situation that each farmer is going to have to judge if it's possible.
Yeah. And there's just so many variables when it comes to seeds. And obviously, when making that kind of investment, we want to be able to point them in the right direction.
Correct.
Based on what's going on in the environment itself. And then Is there a difference when it comes to soil types and how they are planting that as well?
I live down in the Ozarks, and so we have a lot of rocks. And so we can have a lot of issues with what's going to work, what's not going to work. Planting bluegrasses down here, one, because of the heat, and two, because of our soil types, just don't work. The further north we get, we tend to see those things be more productive than what you would have in southern Missouri. But that's another issue from a no-till aspect, is that sometimes you've got so much compaction and so little topsoil that you're really not going to have a whole lot of work there. So doing some soil health to get up to that point can sometimes be imperative, but it's expensive though as well.
Yes, exactly. And now when we were talking about rolling into our hay ground. So on my farm myself, obviously, I have Missouri Southern seed that I used. And just by the way that I've over the years taken care of it, my stand is about 7 years old.
Okay.
So, and it's staying pretty well. A lot of guys come into the store when it comes to their hay ground and ask that they want to go ahead and interseed. What recommendations do you have for interseeding, and what are some of the seeds that some of the grasses maybe that you would steer away from when interseeding into that alfalfa?
So on an alfalfa component, and this is strictly going to be more of a hay situation,
Correct.
Finding something, depending if you're going to dry bale, and finding something too that's going to be a wet bale can kind of change that topic a little bit. On a dry bale situation with a thinning stand, I would suggest orchard grass is probably going to be your best component. One, for added tonnage, and two, just because of the molecular component of the plant, it can cure. Whereas if you're going to wet bale, I even find the best for ryegrass to be a wonderful component to add to it. However, it has 4 sets of chromosomes in there instead of 2, which means it's going to have more sugar content, but it's also going to have more water content. And it just makes it a little bit more difficult to get it to cure. But wet bale, it's fantastic. Another option that would change totally away from grasses is to add another legume. An annual legume such as frosty berseem clover matches up with the timing of your alfalfa. And so typically your alfalfas want to be cut on a 28 to 30 day interval. And by adding this, you're going to get at least 2 to 3 cuttings of a high protein product. We have done it on our own property, seeding it anywhere from 5 to 7 pounds, depending on the age of the stand. If the stand was, say, 5 years and really already starting to weaken, we've put in 5 pounds per acre. And then if it's like the 7th year, I've gone up to 7 or 8 pounds to the acre just to get more longevity out of it. And typically it's added excellent tonnage and palatability and RFQ values. All those things have been excellent when adding that component. Typically by the 4th cutting, if you're lucky to get a 4th cutting, it's gone. Yeah. And it's moved on to crabgrass at that point.
Yeah. So when it comes to looking at, obviously the guys want the best bang for their buck when they're coming in to buy the seed, specifically around that hay ground. So you offer both coated and uncoated. Can you kind of tell us the difference between those and why somebody would go with one over the other?
On grasses, my opinion is coated seed really isn't the best bang for your buck. However, when dealing with a legume, there are additives that you can add to that product that can really help. An inoculant tied onto a legume is really going to help productivity. And that inoculant changes from each species. So your alfalfas and your clovers use a specific type of inoculant. Your soybeans use a specific type. Cowpeas, Lespedizas, they all use different strains of rhizobium. And it's imperative to have that on there, especially if you have never planted that legume in that field to help get that product established. The benefit of having an inoculant tied to your seed is that it's going to create more nodules on your plant, which is therefore going to help you set more nitrogen into your ground. Typically, your clovers and your alfalfas, there are only so many seeds per square foot that are going to work. And we're reducing the amount of seeds in a bag by adding a 34% limestone component to get that inoculant to adhere to the seed. But with that being said, over a 2-year period, you find that stand is healthier having that as a coated product than you do as a raw product, just because of getting that rhizobium into the soil and creating that healthier root system. Again, grasses, there's not a whole lot of additives. I mean, you can add fungicide packages, you can add water packages to it, and they do work. And over time, that's fine. But I think raw seed is probably the better way to go when dealing with a coated fescue or a coated orchard grass and so on.
Now, when it comes to your hay ground, and I have some guys that want to interseed a Timothy grass in there. And a lot of times, I think there's a timing situation there to get that plant to flourish like it should without being drowned out by the alfalfa that's in there. Is there a certain timing when it comes to putting, interseeding stuff like that we need to be looking at to make sure the alfalfa doesn't drown it out by the cover that it has?
Correct. So in my area, your alfalfa really starts coming out of dormancy in that late March, early April timeframe. You're probably 2 weeks behind me, I would assume, from that aspect. But getting in there before it comes out of dormancy is pretty important. Otherwise, like you said, it's going to end up creating a canopy and it'll end up, just shading it out where it can't get enough nutrients. Another issue can be if you've got a really thick stand, you've already got an established root system. And because of that, and especially with it being alfalfa, it's got a deep taproot to it as well.
Yeah.
And so it's really hard for a seedling to get established when you've got other products soaking up all the fertilizer components, all the moisture, so on and so forth. In my opinion, on a grass, it's actually going to be better to establish it in the fall than it is here in the spring. However, we seed lots of grasses in the spring because we need to. But in an alfalfa component, it's probably best to either do it in late February or I would say, 1st of October time frame to get it established before we get to that June, July heat. And then all of a sudden it just, fizzles out.
Right. Yeah. And that's what I caution people on when they do come in and ask about that, because, if you get too late in there,
right.
Well, your existing is already starting to take off. I think that it's a different scenario if you're starting with bare ground.
Correct.
And planting that way. So now transitioning to, okay, we're transitioning our whole field from, maybe we had corn, soybeans, we've gone through that. Now we're going to start our hay ground. It's in that rotation. Is there any recommendations? Obviously, everybody wants some legumes in there, clover, and some grass. I also, when I go through it, I recommend some sort of like oats or, something
as a nurse crop.
Yep, to get that started. What are the basic components that you would say for starting out your hay ground? And this would be for dry hay.
I may have a different opinion than some, but I am a fescue advocate. I think there's good fescues, and I think, there's Kentucky 31, which can have its issues. We tend to overpopulate our cattle population on a per acreage basis down here horribly. It's one of the only components on the scale that we're talking about that can have good spring growth and good fall growth, from a stockpiling situation clear into January, February. So I always like to add a component of fescue.
What kind of fescue do you recommend? Because obviously there's issues with fescue,
There can be. We've had good success with endophyte freeze. The University of Missouri has not had a lot of good success with endophyte freeze. Back in the 90s and in late 80s even, they developed two varieties that weren't the best. They didn't have very good adaptability, to our area, and they would just fizzle out and die. But there's been some work done, and I've had stands on our farm for probably about 20 years now, and it does a good job. Orchard grasses are another great component. I personally would go with the improved varieties over the Potomacs and the Hallmarks. You have a place for those, but if you end up adding it for a hay component, the proprietaries will end up giving you better regrowth, and they also have a lot more rust resistance. Potomac and Hallmark can have some issues that if we have a really wet spring, that they can develop rust, and that can cause issues with palatability when you're feeding your hay. Typically they're a little bit more expensive, but I would say within 1 year's time, just because of production, you can get that money back pretty easily. I spoke earlier on intermediate ryegrasses, and I think those are a good additive as well. Not something I would want my whole stand to be in any capacity, but it's something that, especially on a short rotation, can add some value, both from a sugar content, water content, all those types of things, but they can be very, very healthy for the cattle.
And when you talk about a short stand, how long are you?
On an intermediate ryegrass, we're typically getting 2, maybe 3 years in the transition zone. You get into the northern territories, you start getting into Minnesota, and they maybe can get, 3, 4 years out of it. But in my area, in your area, I think 2 to 3 tops is what you're going to get. It just isn't something that can just last too long because of the weather we have. Like I said, the further north you get, the better soils you get. I mean, in your area in Northwest Missouri, they used to raise bluegrass, even for seed production back when you and I were kids. And that doesn't happen anymore because Oregon and Washington and Idaho can just raise more seed. But it's also a nice additive to a pasture setting or even a hay setting, just from a different product. It's very palatable, but it's just not a lot of tonnage. So to me, from a tonnage aspect, fescue and orchard are going to be great. Timothy is fantastic, both from a palatability and tonnage, but survivability is our biggest issue, especially down in my area. 2 to 3 years is about all we get out of a stand of Timothy. But from a standpoint of just pure forage, that's about as good of a hay product you can have, especially if you add a red clover to it or something of that nature. It's top of the line.
Yeah, it seems people really like that, definitely.
Correct.
So, yeah.
If you end up doing a lot of hay in the spring, graze in the fall situations, to me, the fescue orchard is going to do you better. If it's just strictly hay field, then that's when I start looking a little bit more into my brome, and then I start looking into those Timothy situations. Brome's going to be very slow to establish. Typically, it's going to take you at least a couple years to get a really good stand of brome. But if you've got the time and you have the patience, that it ends up being an excellent hay component as well. Not that you can't graze it, because we sell, a pasture setting called Flex. I've got a competitor that sells another one that's very similar to our mix. And it's still really, really good product for grazing. It's not something that's going to give you that great fall grazing component. So if you're heavily reliant on fall grazing, then you should be looking at another component with it at least.
I think that's a lot of information for people when it comes to hay. It's extremely important for all of us having winters like we do. We got to make sure we make it to spring so that we can get stuff back on the pastures.
Right.
So those are, when you're looking at cattle specifically, and majority of their diet is around the forages themselves. So it's very important for us to give this information to people and be able to also, explain why we have what we have, why we're planting what we're planting. But we also have other people in there that want to look at things like brassicas and herbs and things like that when it comes to some additional forages that have some other nutritional or better nutritional value that's not necessarily a long-term look at things, but maybe to supplement, essentially. Do you want to talk a little bit about the brassicas?
Sure. Typically, brass can really add some good protein value to your pasture settings. It can be used in a hay setting. However, you're going to definitely want to make sure that you wet bale and don't dry bale, because otherwise you'll be awfully upset with that curing process. But there are crosses that have really added some benefits to grazing purposes. You even see a lot of dairies use some of these specific crosses. So they'll take a product like rape and turnip, and they'll cross those. And we have one at the moment that's called Vivant. Instead of having a bulb to it, it'll have more of a taproot, and we'll end up creating very good leaf matter for grazing purposes. You tend not to have any issues with tainting of milk if you end up having a dairy situation with that product. Whereas if it was just strictly a turnip, you would have to watch that, but doesn't take much per acre either, so if you're really on a budget, it really can add some good forage on an annual basis that doesn't break the bank. They're awfully small seeds, and it only takes various species product, 1 to 2 pounds, and all of a sudden you think you've got a whole field of it and wonder if there's really anything else in that stand. But it can really help from that aspect of adding some good protein. Regrowth on them is pretty good as well. Got another one that's called Winfred Brassica. That's going to be a cross of a turnip and kale. So it gets a little bit taller in height than what your Vivint will do. Regrowth on them is really good as well, to where you can get some good multiple grazings, 2 to 3 grazings before it'll end up fizzling out and just reaches maturity and can no longer sustain itself.
Is there any recommendations that you have when it comes to, guys, as some of us have dry lots that are, you can still grow something in it, but is something like a Brassica in those lots something you would recommend, or is there anything else that you would recommend to put in those lots?
It can. Like I said, it's going to depend on your situation. So like our feedlots that we overwinter our cattle in, they're always just mud by the time we get the cattle out of there at the end of March, 1st of April. And so we use heavily some annual ryegrasses with the intermediate ryegrasses, a little fescue. We've got a product called Fix-A-Lot, just because we know we're going to end up just abusing that ground again 8 months down the road. And so it's something that's pretty economical to where you can just do that. Brassicas, when planted in early April, typically can give you production till July, sometimes maybe the 1st of August. Otherwise, you're going to have to come back in at August timeframe and redo something again. But from a protein standpoint, it's really good. And like I said, it's very economical to plant those things, in my opinion, on a cost per acre basis. There's been times even when you get to the dry lot aspect, you can add pearl millet to it, as well, and then throw in a brassica to where you can feed all throughout summer and not have any issues whatsoever. And until you get to that frost point, when you get to 1st of October, and then you can end up planting, something else if you needed it, or if you're going to abuse it like we do, then you can just say, well, it is what it is, and we'll go into winter with it being bare. So did I answer that correctly?
Yes, you did.
Okay, that's good. I wasn't sure if I was going down the right path with that one or not.
No, it's just one of those things that, those are things that guys ask, right? So when they're asking those questions, there's multiple different answers for right. Just depending on the application itself. And those are some of the questions that I try to ask is, those detailed things and try to focus on what the needs of the individual is when they come in. Because, are you going to abuse it? Or are you planning on, what are you doing in the aspect of, is that always going to be that kind of a lot? Or is it going to be a transitional piece? Yeah.
It's also a product too you got to watch. If you just do a straight field of brassicas, which is perfectly fine, you're going to have to kind of just gradually introduce the cattle into it. If you just let them into it completely, there's times where they're like, this isn't palatable at all. But if you take a hot wire and you just section off, a strip, it's awfully rich. There's times that those protein levels can be 30+%. And you just have to be very, very careful. Otherwise, it's going to be so rich that they're not going to want it. But if you do the gradual and then all of a sudden they'll just gobble it up. Another product that's more of a perennial basis is going to be chicory. And typically your chicories are going to last 3-4 years, depending on how they're managed. But also a situation where it's a small seed and you can add it into a field, or you can leave it as itself, but would provide good protein product and everything of that nature. You see some dairies, especially in New Zealand, they like to use a lot of chicory within their rotation of ryegrasses and orchard grasses as just another source of protein.
Well, I know my pasture sure can grow chicory just fine. So
yeah, and luckily the product we're selling isn't what we see on the side of the roads. The wild chicory is pretty rough looking.
So that's why I wanted to make sure we talked about that, because it is not the same thing.
It is not. This is less stem and more leaf matter.
Perfect.
And so
it's all you see is that nice wire, in our opinion,
blue flower, and then you want to spray that out.
Yeah, exactly. So with that, also one of the things, in our area, obviously, is when it comes to wildlife, right? Because we have guys in your area and in mine that do food plots and, do all of those different things. Now, with you guys at Missouri Southern Seeds, what kind of items, or I should say seeds, do you offer when it comes to wildlife when guys are looking at food plots and those kind of things?
So the main thing is to identify what you're wanting to attract. If you're looking at everything, then we're going to have some patience and so on. But if it's mainly deer, you've got to realize that deer want to browse. And they like, one day they want some oats, one day they want wheat, one day they want clover, one day they want a brassica. It's awfully hard to determine what a deer is going to want from one year to the next. But typically, you're going to want a smorgasbord per se. Another thing to consider is to keep your annuals with your annuals and your perennials with your perennials. You start mixing clover in with your annuals, and come the following spring, you're going to be awfully upset if you've got turnips and ladino together, where you're just going to have a lot of bare spots. And so if you're going to do situations like that, do strips. Say I want turnips here, or I want turnips on the edge, and then on the inside, I'm going to have wheat. And then the next corner, I'm going to have ladino or alfalfa or chicory and so forth. But giving them variety of things to eat is going to be important. We sell in the fall a fall wildlife mix that's going to consist of oats, wheat, rye, winter peas, turnips, and rape. People can add other annual clovers to it if you wanted to. Things like Berseem clover, Balanza clover, Persian clover. They're very, very palatable, but it's also not something that is going to, be there for a long period of time. From a perennial basis, we typically would put our alfalfas and our ladinos together, and even your chicories, whereas we sell a product called Deer Magic, and that's what that's going to consist of. But typically, your perennials are going to need better quality soil. You don't want to just go reclaim, an acre from the woods and be planting your alfalfa and your ladinos. You're going to be pretty upset that it's going to be short-lived. That's where you're going to want to put your cowpeas in the summertime to help build that soil, disc it under to get some of that organic matter back into it to make a healthy food plot. Turkeys are going to be different. They too like to browse, but your wildlife packages, a lot of them, they like your clovers, red, whites. They like a product called chufa. Biggest issue with chufa is that you're really not going to be hunting over it. It's something that you're going to provide them just a food source throughout the course of summer. They kind of grow like a peanut underneath the soil. It's actually a weed, more like a nutsedge more than anything, but it propagates under the soil, and so they'll go in, they'll scratch those up, and they're awfully happy with that.
Nice. Yeah. So there's just so many options, like you said. It just depends on the application.
It really does.
Yeah.
And
so we have a lot
figuring out how much sun that area is going to get, figuring out what application, what you're trying to draw. It's awfully cumbersome at times.
Yeah, it's a very detailed process. And
it is.
That's it. Why, when a lot of people come in or call you, it's a process of sitting down and discussing what your needs are. And so it's not, you don't just have, this is what you need no matter what. It's okay, let's fit it, because one size doesn't fit all.
That's very correct.
When it comes to the seeds. Now, when we talk about I have a book that you guys have out, which would be your planting charts that you have in there. So when we're talking about mixing the seeds, obviously with the planting chart itself, that rate is based on that individual seed itself.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
So when we talk about starting to mix things, then we need to make sure.
You need to adjust.
Yeah, we're not overseeding, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, that's the last thing we want to do is get too much seed on there and then not have the results that we need when it comes.
You can actually create another problem with just if you get too many seeds per square foot, depending on what the seed is, you can create a little mini drought in the field because you've got so many products trying to suck up the nutrients, suck up the moisture, to where all of a sudden there just is none. And then all of a sudden you've got a failure. Typically, when looking at the product guide, you're going to want to take the full seeding rate of each product and then figure out what percentage of that stand you want and then move on from there. And then also realizing that brassicas, like I said, are so small seeded, it really doesn't take much to all of a sudden think, man, I've got a lot of seed out there. whenever you see that canopy open up and it just looks like a field of turnips.
Well, and I just think about that when it comes to, when you apply it to when your grandmother or your mother is planting carrots,
right.
They're a very small seed.
Yep.
And you go in there and you're like, oh, I think I could, I don't need that many, I need a lot, right? Because that seed is so tiny. And then you start doing it and you're like, uh-oh, I have no room for that root to actually grow. And that's definitely a factor that you have to think about. You have to make sure that you have plenty of root space as well, so that, I feel like the roots make for a healthy plant. And we have to remember that.
More times than not, what's underneath the soil is more important than what's on top. And it's hard to convey that at times and get that understanding.
Now, for just a little bit about your business itself, how long have you guys been around for?
So we have been around since 1982. My father started that business at that time. And then a couple years after that, he was able to hire Doug Hartman, who you would know. And those two helped make the company into what it is today. And I started here in 2008. I took over. My dad passed away in 2014. And so Doug's helped guide me, and we're very fortunate. We've had a really good sales staff.
You have so much experience within that sales staff. It's
very much so. For me, it was a blessing. Like I said, this thing could have gone a whole nother direction. The staff has been really good, from warehouse staff to truck drivers, everything. We've been very, very fortunate.
And do you see any issues supply-wise with any seeds for this year?
Every year. Yeah. It's just 1 year you've got an abundance, and then the next year you've got a shortage. It really can be. Since COVID, we had a lot of issues with shortages throughout COVID. Everybody spent time home, especially on the turf side of things, to where things just really skyrocketed in price, and things are coming back down from that aspect. But every year, we buy seed from all over the country and sometimes even around the world in order to supply things. And it's a constant worry about the Dakotas. They're not getting enough rain this year. What's the rye situation going to be like come September for cover crops? But at the moment, everything out in Oregon, where we get the majority of our seeds from, is sitting in pretty good shape. Sorghum sedans, we haven't talked about summer forages much, but there's some things, depending on variety basis, that may be short, but there's plenty of product still. Same thing with pearl millet. There's certain vendors had a hard time raising it this past year, but luckily we sided with one guy, and then we're going to have a good supply. But like I said, it varies from product to product on that, and don't realize how much of a world market we can have on some of these things. We get stuck to our little honey hole here and think that everything's just perfect,
And with all of the lots of seed that you get in, you guys go through and you do germ testing on that seed, correct? So
everything that I receive, I have a deal with the state. So I probe everything. Half of it I send off to my lab, which I like to use Missouri Crop Improvement. And then the other half of that split sample goes to the Missouri Department of Ag, just to make sure that everything that we send out is going to be what we say it is.
Perfect. Because that's a lot of guys do ask that. And then if they're going through any kind of programs, those are very important things.
Right.
I know from our aspect of it, a lot of times we'll save back those tags just to make sure, because you never know when guys get pretty excited and they start planting and those tags disappear. So that's one thing that is nice, that, we make sure, hey, if you need that, you got to save your tag. But we've pretty much so got them covered. We've learned that it does happen, and I get it. You're trying to rush and beat the rain and try to get some stuff in before, and you don't even think about it, and you start tossing things like that. So, no, I appreciate you coming on today and talking with us. There's just the biggest thing that I wanted to get from this is to show people there are so many options available. And you guys do a really good job of having those availability, for the different options, whatever it might be, from even your lawn to pasture and wildlife. There's just that you guys have quite the variety. and do a really good job helping, train us in making sure that, hey, if anybody comes into our store and has questions that we can't answer, we can reach out to you guys and ask that question. And you guys are wonderful to deal with. So
Well, thank you.
Appreciate it.
Well, we appreciate you just as much. So thanks so much for nice words.
Thanks for visiting at the Feed Store Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and on YouTube so you never miss an episode. Follow us online and check out our full lineup of products on feedersgrain.com. See you next time.